Well, thank you very much, Claus Offe, for this inspiring introductory remarks. I want to thank the school, the Hertie School of Governance, for putting this together. It's my second time here at the Hertie School, and it's wonderful to pay homage to the scholarship of Claus Offe. I'm just going to tell you sort of a footnote that Claus had confided to me. I think it was in the shadow of a very tall tower in Dubai. It was the Burj Khalifa. You can imagine him close to the Burj Khalifa. Was telling me about his professional life and was making balance sheet about what he had done. But then he told me a very interesting sentence about the way he views social sciences, and he ended up writing about that in a biographical entry. And that's what he says. I cannot really imitate his voice, but I will try. I've always been convinced that social science research is virtually worthless unless its findings provoke, throw light on, or serve as argument in normative discourses on the nature of a good life and its defining feature of freedom and justice, and propose ways to achieve it. So a high bar for us today in the panel to achieve, but nonetheless, we'll try to do our best. I was asked to chair the panel on transition to democracy, condition, modes, quality of outcome. And I'm going to just take each of those concepts and try to frame the debate so my dear colleagues on the left would be able to develop that furthermore afterwards. By the way, just parenthetically, I'm a professor in Joseph Courbet School of International Studies. My name is Micheline Ishay, and I'm currently living in Abu Dhabi as a visiting professor. So I have a sort of a particular interest in the Arab uprising and the various arguments of transitions to democracy. So with the Arab uprising, which have swept through the Levant, through the Middle East, we are asked once again to reflect on prospect of democratization. So let's think about the conditions. Claus Offe just mentioned that just minutes ago. Discourse on democratizations indeed tends to be inspired by well-charted paths toward democratization that have occurred in the West. Ideally or inductively, democratizations will be the result of some form of an amalgamation of conditions that will shape the outcome of social changing depending on the dosage of various factors. They can include the level and pace of industrialization, the domestic and global status of capitalists, the political maturity of civil society, the rise of key actors, the middle class, the elite, or others, and key technology, along with gradual entrenchment of representative institutions. But we also know that scholars have disagreed on the importance of the relative strength of this or that ingredient in that social Molotov, the oldest Eastern European cocktail that preceded the collapse of the Soviet Empire or the Arab uprisings, and have a generally poor record in predicting dramatic transformation. But as I have these conversations with Claus on about the paucity of social science, he just recently responded to me with this same insightful point that social science predicting ignorance is a blessing. Had a regime breakdown been anticipating by ruling elite, they might have made a stronger and arguably successful effort to prevent or to stop it. Well, once again, he succeeded in putting me in temporary silence by giving my relentless disenchantment with aspect of social sciences. But as Claus Offe knows, I have to think about ways to counter-argue him. So if we take you all a little bit to ancient political theory, in fact, we can see that there is some form of an advantage here. Aristotle politics, for instance, meticulously detailed the transformation of different types of government. And when it comes to explaining the cause of revolutions, first concept, the condition, the causes of revolution, Aristotle wrote in very clear terms that revolution arises out of the notion that those who are equal in any respect are equal in all respects. And Aristotle also adds that revolution can only and also be driven by minorities who believe that their natural superiority is denied to them. So Aristotle, in fact, reminds us that we need to understand the state of mind and intentions of political challengers. Applied to the Arab uprising, Aristotle's categorizations of motives rather neatly identifies two factions among the challengers in the Arab Spring, namely that there was a secular democratic movement which was aspiring to political equality for all, and a Salafist movement that believed its superiority and a right to rule has been decided already by God. In question, however, is the strength of moderate Islamists and with whom, in that cauldron of post-revolutionary politics, they will ultimately ally. So these categories of intentions draw us directly to the factor that animated the revolutions. The movement for political equality was able to draw on two sources of support. First, well-educated adherents who recognized the potentials of social media and non-governmental organizations as instruments for organizing and networking in civil society. And second, the unleashed power of women within civil society. The Islamists had the advantage of organizational power, which enabled the Muslim Brotherhood to win elections in a landslide, despite spending the first part of the revolution truly in the backseat. But the motives and relative strength of these groups are, of course, no longer invisible and form part of that picture, that broader picture we must all consider in assessing the prospect for democratic transition. And now I'm going to move to the second part of the concept that Professor Offe asked us to discuss in this panel, and that's the issues of modality. So we know that the means or the mechanism used in the process of democratic transition will inexorably always shape political outcome. Social contexts will even foster different revolutionary paths depending upon the composition of civil society in relationship with the nature of the state. Aristotle, just to go back to him for a second, understood that very well, maintaining that a large middle class serve as a buffer against social polarizations and even extreme form of inequality. Social scientists have written 2,000 years later, sort of during the 1916, in a very similar vein, suggesting that by incorporating the insight into a stage theory of democratization in which some particular sequence, a point that Claus Offe brought in his early comments, example, education, industrialization, expanding middle class, can improve the likelihood of a stable democratic outcome. But if we are to put aside, just for a minute, how much strength of modern political science is indebted to Aristotle, one can note one important flaw in those Cold War era theory of social transformations to free market democracy, i.e. that these approaches indeed overlooked the fact that transitions from feudalism to capitalism and democracy in the West were accompanied by imperial expansionism, colonialism, followed by neocolonialism, which included the destruction, the enslavement, or the exploitations of masses of humans. And setting aside, for just a moment, such problematic details in favor of a linear path in which development went straight forward toward democracy and prosperity, this modernization theory pervaded hegemonic foreign policy circle and helped to rationalize Western support for friendly dictators who needed, in fact, to help crushing masses uprising within the developing world. In this panel, on my left, Stephen Holmes will consider how the idea of a natural political sequence, just using his term, from authoritarianism to competitive electoral politics, and continue to shape United States thinking after the Cold War, including, in his word, the run-up to the Iraq War and extending the US elite perspective on the Arab uprising. But broadly speaking, there have been really a variety of modalities over democratic transitions in the West, not in the developing, just in the West itself. Where revolutions were violent in France, such as during the bloody days of July in 1848, and during the Paris Commune in 1871, when the state was weakening and civil society awakening. Revolutionary change, by contrast, was reformist in England, when the British elite, fearing revolutionary contagion that would come from the continent in 1848, gradually adopted human rights principles. Finally, even the early stages of transitions have at times been guided with sort of a Bonapartist fist, such as in the case of Bismarck, Germany, during a period where civil society was still polarized and Germany fragmented. So considering this sort of East and Western European experience, Claus Offe has greatly deepened the debate over the variety of transitions, rebuffing, of course, the claim of one natural sequence toward achieving and consolidating democracy. I know others have done the same. Philip Schmitter is with us today, and others have sort of deepened the debate over plurality of modality as we consider the notions of transition. But in the debate over modality of transition, I want just to, perhaps my own personal interest in this, show some level of in-depthness to Gramsci's linkage between category of civil societies and revolutionary paths and prospect. Gramsci had argued that the more civil society is entrenched, the greater the likelihood of reform. On the other hand, the more civil society is gelatinous, we all recognize this word of him, the greater the possibility of violent revolution, or what Gramsci usually calls sort of the war of maneuvers. If this proposition, just for a second, let's imagine, holds up, as in the case of the Arab uprising, which is characterized by non-hegemonic civil societies and weak states, and where regimes have collapsed, really, literally like sandcastles, with little or no economic capacity to move forward, the process of consolidation will be very, very difficult. For example, by Gramsci's criteria, Egypt, while not unique in its propensity to revolt, may turn out to an Arab state with a precarious and economic precondition for a peaceful transition and consolidation. The question is even more complex, is that there are so many other external interests when it comes to Egypt. One may expect, given the fragmented character of its civil society and the scarcity of its economic resource, a very long process of consolidation if further setback do not halt this process. And we don't know whether that will happen. But it will be nonetheless interesting to see how Libya will fare in comparison, given that particular framework of understanding, given its highly fragmented civil society on the one end and its oil revenue on the other end. Coming to the last point that we need to address in this panel, which is the quality of political outcome. Well, as a scholar in human rights, I cannot do anything but always go back to texts and visions of rights principles, such as the Universal Declarations of Human Rights and other international human rights covenants. I understand they do not provide guidelines for reconciling modalities or means and ends. Yet human rights ideals provide a normative framework for assessing the viability of proposed transition at every stage of a process, of democratization process, if one wishes to see that and focus on that. So to avoid plotting a linear path in which universal human rights is reserved to some distant endpoint, one can imagine designing an agenda for democratic transitions that integrate different families of rights. In fact, the premise here is that one cannot isolate any of those families of rights, certainly not security or economic rights or political rights, to be done in a sequential manners. In fact, I'm always like to go back to Amartya Sen's in this respect, because he understood the importance of integrating the spectrum of rights at every stages of development, and one can say also at every stages of transition. That aspiration equally applicable to post-war or post-revolutionary state. So broadly speaking, what do we face here with? Well, let's imagine many of us think that a republican government, or at least as understood by Kant, with its separations of power and constitution or fundamental laws, coupled with a fair modicum of popular representations, have really proven to be the best forms of government over time for implementing rights. But arriving at this goal is not such an easy proposition. It's so challenging, in fact, for fragile states with little or almost no democratic experience. In those cases, there is very, very little guarantee that initial success will be consolidated. Democracy may be soon oversold in the context of economic stress or lingering social cleavages. Even more alarming are cases where seemingly entrenched democracy come under the challenge, a concern that is addressed in this panel in a very different way by Ivan Krastev and Jacques Rupnik. What is the meaning of the erosion of semi-consolidated democracy in the former Soviet Empire, as witnessed by strengthening grassroots nationalist movements and the rise of authoritarianism? To turn to the ongoing European crisis, what are we to make of transitions to technocracy which are imposed without election in Greece and Italy? To paraphrase Krastev, is democracy oversold as the cure for all societal problems? These concerns echo also Claus Offe insight regarding post-communist transition, namely the problem, I love that quote, building capitalism without capitalism and democracy without democrats, in particular without a democratic working class movement. So I will just end by, I will conclude with a sort of series of questions that maybe my fellow panelists here will be addressing, and if not, maybe in the question and answer part. And those are the following. What are the historical lessons should we draw on as we consider conditions, modes, and prospect for future transitions to democracy? Example, with respect to the Arab uprising. Conversely, what can we learn from the past to the erosion of long-standing or newer democracy, example with respect to the EU or Eastern Europe? The success story of Eastern Europe would have been impossible to imagine in the absence of powerful external incentive and pressures. Are conditional rewards also a key to consolidating democracy in the Arab world? Are the costs of failure high enough, and are the necessary investment feasible, at least in the North African case? Are there other lessons to be derived from 1989? Or do the difference overwhelm effort to draw useful comparisons? Perhaps it's not 1989 that we should be focused on, but 1848, as there was also a period of famous revolutionary contagions that offer perhaps more insight and guidance regarding the unfinished uprising in the Middle East. So on this question of comparative transition, I've had the good fortune to have conversations, lengthy conversations with Klaus. Hopefully we will end up finishing an article which is always stopped because the events in the Middle East keep moving so fast. So we as an intellectual have very little time to just catch up on the events. So as soon as we write, the events are just changing. So hopefully it will slow down and we'll be able to finish this article. while challenging and even inexhaustibly inquiring into the condition, modes, and quality of revolutionary democratic aspiration, demand provisional answers that provide, at least tentatively, guidance on policy. So at a historical moment of widespread political upheavals, inquiry into the status of democracy raises particularly timely and demanding questions, which are those ones that I will now turn to my colleagues on my left, and in order, I will ask Professor Stephen Holmes to begin. Yes, I just want to make sure that I don't miss the association. So New York is from New York University School of Law, so I will ask him to speak first, and then Ivan Krastev from the Center for Liberal Strategy in Sofia, and the IWM Institute of Human Science in Vienna, and then Jacques Rupnik in Sciences Po in Paris. So welcome my fellow panelists, and thank you.